Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Eugene's November 15th, 2024 program, The Impacts of the Supreme Court's Grants Pass Decision on Homelessness. My name is Andrew Kalk and I am City Club's president. We're coming to you from our home at the historic Wow Hall in the heart of downtown Eugene, and it's my pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our speakers and to all of you joining us here in person, online, and over the radio. Since 1990, City Club has been dedicated to our founding mission to build community vision through open inquiry. In accordance with our mission and purpose, we hope to help connect people throughout our community and across generations, identities, experiences, and perspectives. You are invited this week and every week to join us in this effort, to share your wisdom, to learn something new, and to take active steps to make a difference in this city and region that we love. Of course, we cannot do this work alone, so a special thank you to our Platinum Community and Diamond sponsors. The Eugene Area Chamber of Commerce, serving as a catalytic leader in creating a vibrant and diverse economy that drives economic opportunity and well-being. Kaiser Permanente, which exists to provide high-quality, affordable healthcare services and to improve the health of our members and the communities we serve. More information at www.kp.org. The University of Oregon has helped Oregonians question critically, think logically, reason effectively, communicate clearly, act creatively, and live ethically since 1876. More information at uoregon.edu. Lane Community College transforms lives through learning. LCC provides comprehensive, accessible, high-quality educational opportunities that promote student success. For more information, visit lanecc.edu. And thank you to the City of Eugene and to Lane County for their support as well. I'd now like to welcome Melissa Gilbert, City Club board member and the coordinator of today's program, to introduce our topic and our speakers. Alyssa.
Hello. So today's program is going to cover the consequences of the Grants Pass case on homelessness. Just going to provide some quick background info. In June of 2024, the case City of Grants Pass v. Johnson, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the 8th Amendment allows cities to punish people experiencing homelessness for sleeping and camping in public spaces. The 8th Amendment prohibits the government from inflicting cruel and unusual punishments. This ruling means that cities can impose criminal penalties for public camping and sleeping even when individuals are homeless involuntarily due to a lack of available shelter and housing in the community. The Supreme Court majority reasoned that the ordinances punished acts, not the status of being homeless, because the ordinances would apply to anyone who sleeps outside in public, regardless of whether they are a person experiencing homelessness, a student protesting, or a backpacker. The dissent countered that because sleep is a biological necessity, unhoused individuals who have no access to shelter cannot avoid sleeping outside, and therefore such laws punish them for being homeless. Our speakers today are Heather Merrick, senior attorney with Oregon Law Center, Everett Meadows, co-host and co-founder of the Oregon Reporter podcast, and Renee Yandel, executive director of HIV Alliance. So I'd like to invite our presenters to the stage right now, and then Heather is going to be first.
Can you hear me okay? Closer. Now can you hear me? Okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to start by briefly discussing housing because I think it provides a really important context for the Grants Pass case that we're discussing today, as well as the challenges that we're facing moving forward. Homelessness is fundamentally a housing issue. Definitionally, homelessness is the lack of fixed permanent housing, but also a lack of housing is the primary driver of homelessness. You can predict rates of homelessness in communities across the country based on the availability of affordable housing. And so even though homelessness seems to be an individual problem, and certainly we know that personal crises like losing a job or an eviction can contribute to a person finding themselves dealing with homelessness. There are societal patterns that we can measure, and whether a personal crisis like experiencing domestic violence results in homelessness depends greatly on the social context in which it occurs. It depends on whether there is housing or social safety nets for that person, say if they're fleeing a domestic violence situation. And we all know that there's very limited housing in Eugene and in Oregon. Economists say that statewide we're going to need something like 140,000 more units to meet the current need. And we have really low rates of vacancy for the rental housing and also homes for sale. And affordable housing is even more scarce. Eugene, for instance, here a third of renters pay more than half their income towards rent, and 30% of your income is what's considered to be sustainable. And 1 in 5 people in this city lives in poverty, which means that they make, for an individual, less than about $1,200 a month. Well, the median rent in Eugene is more than $1,200 a month. So for a person who's in that situation to be able to afford the typical unit, they would need to spend 100% of their income. And so a lot of people are just an emergency away from homelessness. And we know from our data that the overwhelming majority of evictions in Oregon are because people couldn't afford to pay their rent. 82% of people experiencing homelessness in Lane County were previously housed here, which, to put it another way, our unhoused neighbors were previously our housed neighbors. And when people fall into homelessness, there's often nowhere to go. Nationwide, we have a shelter shortage, but Oregon is particularly dire. We have the second highest rate of unsheltered homelessness. 2/3 of people experiencing homelessness have no shelter. We have the largest share of families who are unsheltered. Eugene has 3/4 of its population that's experiencing homelessness has no shelter. And in the county, we only have enough emergency shelter beds to meet the need of 18% of the numbers of people who are experiencing homelessness. So when there's nowhere to go, people still need to sleep somewhere. And usually it's outside, usually in public spaces, and quite often that is illegal. And so that's the context in which the Grants Pass case arose. And in Grants Pass, the situation was even more dire than that. There's a 1% vacancy rate, meaning 1% of units would be available to rent at a given time. And there were 600 people counted as being unhoused when the case started. And there wasn't really the one place that sort of functioned like a shelter had 138 beds, but it also had a lot of restrictions based on gender, work requirements, religious practice, and a bunch of other regulations. So not enough beds, and also beds that a lot of people couldn't access even if they wanted to. And so a lot of people were living outside, still are living outside. This led the city council to meet to discuss what they called the current vagrancy problems. Officials talked about things like busing people out of town. The city council president suggested just making the city as uncomfortable as possible so people would just leave. And one thing they settled on was aggressively enforcing the camping law. The camping law prohibited sleeping anywhere in public at any time with as little as a blanket. And it involved an enforcement scheme that would allow for fines that would snowball, and then also that could lead to trespass tickets that would carry hefty fines that would be misdemeanors, and so could also carry jail time. Some longtime residents filed the lawsuit on behalf of themselves and other involuntarily homeless individuals, arguing that it punished their status of homelessness under the Eighth Amendment. And they drew from a line of cases that had held that it's cruel and unusual punishment to punish someone for their mere status. There was one case in particular, Robinson versus California, that took place in the 60s, where it dealt with a law that prohibited the status of being addicted to narcotics. And the court said that, you know, you can punish things like possessing drugs or selling drugs, or even behavior that people engage in after they've used drugs that's criminal, but you can't punish people for merely having an addiction. That's like punishing someone for being a leper. And the court said that even a day in prison would be too much for punishing someone for merely having a cold. And in 2019, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals drew from that case in Martin v. Boise and held that, that the government can't punish homeless people for resting or sleeping outside when they have no access to shelter. That sleeping outside is an unavoidable biological act, inseparable from the status of homelessness. That is what it is to be homeless. And it's unconstitutional to punish simply sleeping somewhere in public if one has nowhere else to do so. In this case, the district court, the trial court, and the appellate court, Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, agreed that the Grants Pass ordinance violated the Constitution. You know, they said you could still have restrictions on when, where, and how people engage in these, or sleep, or camp, as they put it. But you can't punish it all the time, everywhere. And you can still enforce health and safety laws, like around drugs and public urination or lighting a fire. But that's kind of a separate matter from punishing people for this unavoidable act of sleeping. And we know the case made its way up to the Supreme Court, and the US Supreme Court reversed, overruling Martin v. Boise. Justice Gorsuch wrote for the majority, and they rejected the argument that this punished status, and as was mentioned, the court concluded that this is punishing actions, the actions of the conduct of camping, and that it would apply to anybody, not just someone who has the status of homelessness. And Justice Sotomayor wrote for the dissent, arguing that, you know, criminalizing a bodily function is essentially the same as criminalizing the person. You know, just labeling it action as an action, it's still punishing the person for who they are. And so here, you know, you're punishing sleeping with a blanket, but that's essentially the same as punishing someone for being homeless. So moving forward, the thing that I think is important to note, legally speaking, and I know we'll have time for questions to explore different parts of this, both the majority and the dissent acknowledged that this case just dealt with the Eighth Amendment. It didn't decide whether these ordinances are legal under every doctrine. In fact, they recognized that other constitutional provisions protect people's rights, perhaps in this context as well, and that states and local governments can enact their own protections above and beyond what the Eighth Amendment would provide to deal with these situations. And specifically, they mentioned ORS 195530, an Oregon statute, which was enacted as House Bill 3115 in 2021. And that law requires that regulations around engaging in acts of survival, like sleeping and sitting and staying warm and dry in public, that they be objectively reasonable as to time, place, and manner with regards to persons experiencing homelessness, and that reasonableness, it would be determined based on the totality of the circumstances. There's a mouthful, but that would include considering the impact of the law on people who are experiencing homelessness. And so it requires cities to take into account the experience of people who are unhoused, you know, what they could reasonably comply with, and how the laws impact unhoused residents. But it also gives a lot of latitude to cities to come up with their own solutions and to have time, place, and manner restrictions that make sense given their local characteristics. And so I know we're going to talk more about that law as we move forward. And so I will go ahead and hand it over to the next speaker.
Good afternoon. I'm Everett Meadows. I am a Eugene attorney, and I'm also, the reason I'm here is because I run a nonprofit podcast called the Oregon Reporter Podcast, which is, our mission is to keep Oregon attorneys apprised of current law. And in our production of that show, we've actually covered the Johnson v. Grants Pass case quite a bit. And not just, we covered it when oral arguments were made to the Supreme Court. We covered it after the decision, and now we've covered more of the day-to-day, real-time results of that as counties and municipalities in the state try to navigate the decision. What does this mean in Oregon? What does this mean for us? So, Heather gave us most of the appropriate background here, right? So we kind of go back to the Robinson v. California decision in the 60s, which is cited by the Martin v. Boise court in saying you can't jail people as a result of their homelessness. Johnson v. Grants Pass, a little bit of nuance there, which is you can't cite them or otherwise punish them. So at the Ninth Circuit, this is really an expansion of the Martin v. Boise decision. And as such, when that gets to the Supreme Court, it gets overturned altogether. So in the entirety of the Ninth Circuit, it is no longer illegal to jail or to punish people for certain acts of homelessness. Now, House Bill 3115, which Heather mentioned, is really important in this context because although this Grants Pass decision is clearly an Oregon case, excuse me, it's unclear to me, and I think to a lot of people, what the actual significance of the decision is within the state of Oregon. Because after the Martin v. Boise decision, I believe in 2020, Tina Kotek, then Speaker of the House, pushes forward this relatively comprehensive litigation, or legislation, excuse me, but that is very unclear about what it's intended to do, probably in part because it's intended to be read along with those decisions, Martin v. Boise. When we talk about laws, we talk about case law, we talk about statutes, we talk about other rules, administrative, we talk about local ordinances, and so we read these things together. Well, now with the reversal of Martin v. Boise, how do we read House Bill 3115? And there's been an incredible amount of conversation amongst legislators in the state about that very issue. What does this mean, knowing what we know now? So Heather talked about this objectively reasonable standard. You say objectively reasonable in law school about 20,000 times, and they tell you it's an objective standard, and yet you get out of law school and still no one knows exactly what it means. And obviously that's context dependent. But what does it mean? And so I'm here to talk a little bit about how that's rolling out in Oregon municipalities. I'm going to introduce another law to the conversation, though, because I think it's really difficult to talk about this issue outside of the context of Measure 110. So if I assume a lot of folks here understand that Measure 110 was a Oregon law that had really lessened law enforcement's ability to criminalize possession of small amounts of drugs in the state of Oregon. Measure 110 was rolled back this last year, and in lieu of Measure 110, the state put together a proposal for counties to set up what we call deflection programs. Again, like with House Bill 3115 or perhaps even with Measure 110, nobody really knows what that means. And when the state established this deflection proposal, it was then given to the counties with an offer. If you establish a deflection program within your county, we will give you a certain amount of money. Now, what does this have to do with homelessness? Well, Heather talked a lot about what causes homelessness. Obviously, we know that the lack of housing is probably the most significant factor for homeless people, but there are a number of circumstances that, whether they cause homelessness or homelessness causes the circumstances, they're really inextricably linked. And I think addiction and homelessness are, in this context, a very, very obvious example of this. So when I talk about local enforcement in the wake of the reversal of Martin v. Boise and of course Grants Pass, I'm going to talk about that in the context of deflection programs and the repeal of Measure 110, because I think it makes a lot of sense. And it actually tells us a lot about what the community's values are, what the county's values are, and how those things are going to be approached. Just to be really clear here, these deflection programs are experimental. They're set up on, I think there was a $20.7 million grant established by the state of Oregon, and it was offered to the counties. You can have a piece of this. Come to us with your proposal, and we'll help you fund that program. But that's it. We don't know how this plays out in the future. We don't know how this gets funded in the future. So these programs are experimental. They're very county by county, and we don't know how they go in the future if they're successful and the counties want to keep them going. That's just to get you started here. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Portland, because I think Portland and Multnomah County is sort of the bellwether for the state in a lot of ways, and not in others. But Portland's had a really interesting relationship with these things. By these things, I mean deflection and homelessness. I'm going to go through a bit of a timeline here, and I'm going to start in May. Now, this is obviously before oral arguments on the Johnson v. Grants Pass decision, but we kind of, I think the state at that time knew things were coming. So in May, after oral arguments, but prior to the SCOTUS Grants Pass decision, the Portland City Council approved an ordinance proposed by Ted Wheeler requiring folks camping on public property to accept shelter when available. And the ordinance includes a bunch of other restrictions. This gets pushed forward and allows for a 7-day jailing period, $100 fines. However, in July, when Portland rolls this program out, the county, Multnomah County, refuses to shelter the first people that get arrested under this program. So now all of a sudden we've got counties fighting with municipalities about what's fair, what's humane, and I think it's really easy to criticize the people involved, but it also, I think, highlights the issues here. There are logistical issues, even within government resources. We've got places, but we don't have the ability to use those places because this person's got the key and this person's got the cash, and we don't know how to combine those things. I won't go through all of this. As we know, or as you may know, Portland's had a huge overhaul of their government in the last 6 months or so, and they've just completely revamped their city council. I think they increased it from 5 members to 12, and they've taken a significant amount of power from the mayor. They've got a new mayor there. The city has threatened to tear up their intergovernmental. Portland's a mess. What I will say, is I think there's a lot of optimism in Portland, and that is because of the amount of resources that Portland has. They have a lot of opportunity to try things. So we do know Portland set up a deflection program. We know that a number of people, even as early as September, that I think there had been 71 people who had been directed into the deflection program. Excuse me, and I don't know if I've been clear about this. Deflection is the word that we use when law enforcement makes contact with a person who's suspected to be in possession of drugs and deflects them from the law enforcement program, from the court process into treatment. So Portland has already made 71, as of September, or through September, 71 referrals into deflection, and of those 71, 136 referrals out to treatment, which is tremendous. And because of the amount of people, we're seeing huge numbers. We don't see those kind of numbers from the other counties, but what we do know is that the other counties that are participating in deflection programs, we do know that these things are happening. And I, doing what I do, have an opportunity to speak with folks like Heather and Renee, who are in the people or the treatment sector. I speak with a lot of law enforcement folks, and what I am hearing right now, what I'm hearing from people all around, is guarded, cautious optimism about opportunities, not necessarily what's happening, but the opportunities that are here in this program, both in treating addiction and in starting to address systemic homelessness, because of the fact that those things are so inextricably linked. Not every county in Oregon has signed up for deflection. So notably, Douglas County, just our neighbors to the south, Douglas County has rejected the proposal, has not accepted any of the state's money, and is not going to be setting up a deflection program. And I think you might hear that and say, what? Why would they do that? And whether their reasons are good or not, there are a number of reasons that they've quoted. So one of those is this idea that the funding is not secure. We get money now, we set up a program, and then what? And there's ample reason to think that the state may not support this program in the future. We just don't know. But also, they say, well, we've got a drug court, and we've got drug diversion programs, and we're already doing a lot of the things that we would get through Measure 110 or through deflection programs. We're already doing it with established systems. I think what's missing there, and if I were to talk to someone in Douglas County, I think what I would say is, I think you're missing an opportunity to be combining homelessness and addiction, which we know are inextricably linked, and building a comprehensive program with this money that we have now. We have this money now. We worry about tomorrow's money tomorrow. We worry about today's money today. So I do think there's a missed opportunity there. Lane County has set up a deflection program. We were a little late. I don't know how much time I have, by the way. I just talk and talk. That's my wife. Lane County has set up a deflection program that, I'm not sure I said this, but all of the programs, county to county, are different, and there are different ways of rolling these programs. Lane County has set up a program where, upon contacting a person who's suspected of being in possession of drugs, they call a third party. There's a contractor that they're working with. That contractor then comes to the site and takes over the process, taking that person into, I believe they have 20 beds here in Lane County, taking that person, and they first have to be eligible. They can't have warrants. There are a number of other factors, but then plug them into short-term housing, and then from there, based on participation by the person who's been accused, from there, they plug them into medium-term resources, and our plan is that our program is so new here that I don't know that we've seen this out, but eventually plug them into more mid-term and long-term processes. One final distinction I want to point out among the states, I know this, we're talking about Johnson v. Grants Pass, why are you talking about Measure 110? I think I made it clear, I think they're linked, but I do think that this is where we're starting to see, I think we're seeing a notable convergence. And I'll point out one other thing. So Jackson County, the liberal bastion to the south, joking, it's not funny, I guess. Jackson County has done I think a really clever thing. So Medford was criticized in the last several years. They have their own camping policies. They're pretty harsh, and we understand their enforcement is, or can be, pretty harsh. Jackson County has set up a deflection program, and they have put that program in the Office of Mental Health. They've taken that money, they're increasing their mental health resources, which are, those resources are going to be directly usable for both Measure 110 or post-Measure 110 deflections, but also for homelessness. And so I think as we see this progress, you know, Washington County's got a different approach, Baker County has a different approach. As we see these Measure 110 deflection programs progress, I think we're, in the context of homelessness, going to be able to start to see how these things are all going to work together. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Renee, and I'm the Executive Director at HIV Alliance, and I'm going to talk with you not so much about the cases, because I'm not an attorney, but I'm going to talk to you about the impact on the folks that we serve of the housing crisis and of essentially having to live in encampments. So first, let me tell you a little bit about HIV Alliance, why we're involved in housing. From the beginning of the HIV epidemic, housing has been an issue for people living with HIV. Before there were protections, people could lose their homes just because they had HIV. And today we know that both treatment success for HIV and what we call viral suppression and prevention of HIV is really impacted by housing instability. So we see this, you know, every day at our agency, and you know, for example, our syringe exchange, which we've been running syringe exchange in Lane County since 1999. About 60% of our participants are, will say they have housing instability or are unhoused, and we serve about 2,200 people here in Lane County in the syringe exchange. And we also operate in those other places, so familiar with a little bit about what we were talking about there, Jackson County, Douglas County, a little bit of a different situation, but that's what's going on for us here in Lane County. So I want to say I'm going to talk about the impacts on people who are living in encampments, and I'm not a person living in an encampment, but I think it's really important that we do hear those voices, and we don't have someone like that on the panel today, so I want to encourage you all, if you want to learn more about what this really is like, I'm going to tell you what the stories are shared with me and what my staff tells me, but I would encourage you to lean in and talk to people who have the experience firsthand. So there's a couple things that people need to understand whenever I'm talking to people about this. I think it's really important to understand that wherever a person is camping, whether that's on public or private property, they often feel the safest in that place. It may not look from the outside like a safe place, and we may have all kinds of ways we describe camps that are, you know, this is a public health risk, it's a that risk, it's a this risk. But to the person, that may very likely be the safest place, you know, the place where they feel the safest. Another thing to understand is that everything they own, every single thing they own, every critical document, every piece of dry clothing, everything they own is likely in that camp. And they most likely don't have a way to move it, so not a lot of people with vehicles, some carts, these kind of things, but everything they have will be in that camp. And then, at least for the folks that we engage with on street outreach, many people are experiencing mental health, behavioral health, and in that includes addiction and physical health challenges. Pretty significant. In fact, 88.6% of the people we work with on street outreach will say they have a disabling condition. So those are some things you need to understand when you think about what happens when a camp has to move, you know, to sort of understand the base, what's going on for people. Okay, so now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what some of the consequences are, and then I'll talk to you about one of our projects where we've seen some success in working with encampments. So the first impact that we see that is so kind of real and present every day when you're talking to folks is just the physical impact, the physical burden of having to move a camp. You know, so you get notice, you get a couple of days notice, and then you have to move, as I say, everything you own. You have to do that without losing things, without having things stolen, without having things thrown away. And maybe you yourself are experiencing some physical disabilities that make that very difficult. And that burden is huge for people. You know, they can lose in the process tents and cold weather gear, like I say, critical documents that people need to access services. and it's a hugely disruptive thing for people. The second impact is about connection, and this is a twofold. So I think, people form relationships with other people in the camps, just like we do with our neighbors on the block. If my neighbors, he went to Italy a few months ago, he asked me to watch the house, and people form those relationships with each other in these encampments. And when they have to leave there, they don't all get to go together. There's nowhere to go for most people. So they're going to disband and go about figuring this out on their own. And they often lose that connection to the other people in the camp who have been a support to them. What I hear the most from my staff is the loss of connection to us. And this, I think, is just a huge impact and ripples beyond what I could even probably describe today. But, HIV Alliance, we provide medical care to folks, we provide housing assistance, help getting IDs, food, lots of different things are happening. And most of the folks we're working with in these encampments, they need all of those services. So when they get moved from the encampment and our team can no longer find them, we don't know where they're going, and they don't know where they're going, they can lose access to the social support team, the social service team that is helping them move out of that encampment, essentially. And we've had folks, HIV Alliance does, as you can imagine, syphilis treatment and HIV treatment and treatment of Hep C, and we can lose folks who are in the midst of that treatment. You're in the middle of Hep C treatment, and you're nearing cure with Hep C, because you can be cured from Hep C, and you get swept and we can't find you. And now we can't complete the treatment, and it's a whole start over. The same with syphilis. You're in the middle of getting your shots for syphilis treatment. So there are public health ramifications of that beyond, just for that individual. We've had folks who are days away from getting a housing slot, and this is one of the ones that is just so hard to, even say, but a person who's been waiting for months living outside for a housing slot, days away from getting it, they get swept, we lose them. That slot cannot be held. That slot goes, they lose the slot. So they're back to the start of the whole process. So it's a very disruptive thing when camps get swept in that way. I want to say, we all recognize at HIV Alliance, and I recognize that the camps that people are living in, those are not safe and reasonable places for them to live either. They're not safe and reasonable for the public around those spaces. I understand that, but this is about the impact on those folks and what happens. And it really is overwhelming to see. So now that I've talked about that a little bit, and I want to make sure I got all my impacts I wanted to talk about, I want to tell you about something that we worked on last year under one of the governor's funding programs called All In. So this is Governor Kotek's effort to end houselessness, and HIV Alliance, as I say, we've worked in street outreach and in housing for a very long time, but this was a new project for us. We joined the All In project in Lane County, and you can learn a lot more about this project if you go on the county's website. There's a great dashboard about the All In project and all the different organizations working together on that project. But we decided to work on what's called encampment response. This is a model that has worked in other places, and it is where a team of outreach folks connects to an encampment and has some time to work with that encampment, flexible funds to support people, and really with the goal of helping people move out of that situation and get into housing. There are some critical things that need to be in place for this to work, and I'm going to get to that. But so we were excited to work on this project. We started out, the first camp our team was assigned, and we had a team of 4 or 5 street outreach specialists. We have behavioral health and medical folks who can come alongside the team. The first camp, we got out there, we're working with them for about a week. The camp gets a notice and they have to leave. The camp everyone is removed from the camp. Maybe we had 7 days to work with that camp. And so that didn't work. We got assigned another camp, same thing. The camp gets a notice that they're gonna be swept within a few days. The camp is swept, we can't track anyone down. Finally, on our third try, we were working with a group of folks in an encampment where the property owner or the entity managing that property was able to give us some time to work with the encampment and the folks there. And we had also at that time been able to find a nonprofit partner who was managing a motel. And there's a really interesting piece in Willamette Week, thank you, about these types of housing opportunities. And they were managing had remodeled an old motel, and they were offering those units to people moving out of from being houseless. So we worked with them. We had several weeks to work with the camp. We were able to place people using the all-in funds, which at that time were quite flexible, moving them into these sort of what we used to refer to as SRO, or single resident only, I think is what that meant, motel rooms. And from there, people could move on. You know, we always offer people every option. You know, do you want to go to the shelter? Do you want to go into this motel opportunity that we had? So through that process, we were able to house about 35 folks from encampments. We worked with 2 different encampments, and were successful in housing 35 folks in that property. I think the key thing I want to say, and I know I'm at my time, but for this to work for people, we need to have adequate staffing and teams to be able to work with the encampments. We need to have flexible funds during the time we're working with folks in encampment, because they have a lot of needs. There's a lot of barriers to housing. You have to have funds that can be flexible to do that. And then you need to support the encampment while you're working with them. You know, if they don't have sanitation or they don't have a place to go to the bathroom, that's going to make that encampment an unsafe situation very quickly. And then finally, and I think bringing it all back home to our first presentation here, we need units for people to move into. We have to have a place to go. If we are asking people and making them leave encampments and there is nowhere to go, they will simply go to another encampment. You know, it really is, all of those impacts happen, and yet they're still sleeping outside because there isn't anywhere to go inside. So I think that's a really key point, and it has to be options of places to go. You know, if we offer one, well, you can go to the congregate shelter for 2 weeks and figure it out from there, we're just not going to get there. And there's a lot of reasons why that is, and maybe a whole other program, but I think we have to have flexible options for people. So that's a little bit about our experience at HIV Alliance, and I think we're going to go to questions now. So.
Thank you all so much. We will be beginning questions in just a moment, but first I'd like to thank the business and in-kind sponsors whose support helps to make City Club possible. Thank you to our gold sponsors, the Network Charter School, Hudson Dental, Louvis Cobb, and the Lane Transit District. Thank you also to our in-kind sponsors, KRVM 91.9 Radio, Dotson's Photography, Pack Info, and Kid Sports. Also a special thank you to our award-winning public radio station, KLCC FM 89.7, for airing City Club programs Monday nights at 7 p.m. For those listening at home or in the car right now, your household is one of several thousand tuning into City Club on KLCC, and we love that you're here. You can also find all recent City Club programs archived on KLCC, as well as on our YouTube channel and as podcasts. We'll take a brief break before questions begin. Thanks. Welcome back to the City Club of Eugene's Forum on Homelessness in the wake of the Grants Pass Supreme Court case. First question goes to Kelly Johnson. Kelly.
Thank you all for being here today. What you've kind of described sounds a little bit of like a patchwork response where cities and counties are all sort of doing sort of different things. And it seems like in response to this legislation that could even increase with different municipalities going to the full extent of the law, where others might choose to put in more protections for houseless people. And I'm just wondering, does this sort of like patchwork approach hinder or help? Could some kind of like statewide response that is the same all across the state be better than this kind of patchwork system?
I could try. I think that in the answer to the question, which is better, I think you're going to hear different positions and different people say different things. You know, one of the complaints that we've seen from legislators is that we don't really know what to do given House Bill 3115 and its sort of vague nature. And so we need the state law to be more specific about what we can do. With that said, and I was just speaking with Lori Trieger about this, you know, there is a benefit to giving counties a bit of latitude, right? And Lane County in particular has this beautiful history of setting up these alternative services programs, and some of these have been nationally notable. So I think to answer your question, I do think that there's a lot of power in giving deference to counties to do this how you want, and to establish models based on the counties that have had a lot of success. Measure 110, I think, failed in part because there was no system, and developing the system proved to be too difficult. So given an opportunity, given money, given resources, given enforcement opportunities, I think it'll be really neat to see what the counties come up with. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Just one comment on House Bill 3115 that I think cities advocated for a more flexible approach because circumstances can be so varied. You know, Portland is very different from like a small rural town on the coast. Yeah, or Eastern Oregon. And, you know, cities and counties had a year and a half, and there was a lot of deliberation around the state, and a lot of cities made changes to their local ordinances. And although, you know, there's a lot of conversation about, well, what would be objectively reasonable in a particular community, given all of the circumstances, there actually have been very few challenges to ordinances around the state under the law, that cities have come up with policies, and you know, there's not a lot of litigation. There's only been one lawsuit filed under the law, and that was in Portland. And you know, as previously said, they repealed the old law after that case was filed, and then they implemented a new one that involves giving an offer of shelter to folks and trying to work with folks. And so I think that, what do I think? I think that that like, you know, there's a baseline for people's, you know, what is like protective of people's rights and their humanity, and also the law allowed for a lot of flexibility because our cities are diverse.
Commissioner?
Thank you so much for the presentation. Lori Trieger, City Club member and Lane County Commissioner, and appreciate it, particularly a shout out to our deflection work. My question is, we're talking about a lawsuit. Lawsuits come from complaint, essentially. Folks who are sleeping outside are often left to do so in peace unless someone complains. So when we're talking about protecting the rights and safety of people, I think the ultimate question is whose rights and which people. And a lot of these programs that we're talking about meet with a great deal of resistance because of stigma and assumptions about who needs help and why, and what is, quote, worth investing in. But the solutions face those same challenges, right? It's rare that we try to develop housing somewhere that doesn't get pushback and complaint. We want more housing, but not there. or not like that, or not that big, or not that small, or fill in the blank. So I'm wondering if any of the panelists want to talk about what is ours to do, those of us here who have the ability to sit in this room in comfort or listen to this program, to be part of changing a culture that says this is a problem to be solved by lawsuits and not by us as a community and our own attitudes and investments. Thank you.
I really want to hear what you guys have to say. I just have one quick comment that I think that, you know, we have an incredible community and people want to be supportive of their neighbors. And I think that, you know, appealing to one another's humanity and recognizing that a lot of folks, and trying to differentiate between actual public safety threats, like whether someone is actually committing a crime versus, you know, they're just maybe living in a way that looks kind of, you know, there might be some sanitation issues or other things that feel uncomfortable, to think about whether there's it's a situation that really warrants a law enforcement intervention, and whether, and just kind of thinking about whether some other kind of support as a community member makes sense in that circumstance, because I know we want to support each other.
I guess I would just kind of reflect on, you know, for me, working in the HIV field for the past 20-something years, I've seen the impact of stigma on a lot of things. HIV, for example, is fueled by stigma. And I think what I've seen in that realm is when people can really look at, you know, you have to be willing to look at yourself, look at your friends and your neighbors, think about the things you feel uncomfortable about. And I think now more than ever is a time on this issue, on so many issues, when if you don't understand an issue, if you feel fearful about something, to lean in and learn more about it. And that sounds like, you know, sort of a general response, and maybe not something you can jump up and do right now, but I think that is the way forward for so many. I mean, even people coming to work at HIV Alliance sometimes bring these stigma and bias about, you know, the folks that we're serving, and I think it's important for all of us to look at that. Look, you know, get to your neighborhood association meeting, talk to folks in your social circles about some of these things, and because I think you know, what Lori's getting to is we need more housing, but we can't build more housing. Everybody wants it, but not in their neighborhood, not this tall, not this big, not infill, not outside. You know, it's a very challenging situation, I think, for all of us. I wanted to say something about deflection too, because it was mentioned one thing about the deflection program here in Lane County. And HIV Alliance operates in multiple counties, so we work in Douglas County where they won't have a deflection, Coos County where they won't have a deflection program. But the deflection program here is going to be connecting people to peers who have lived experience. I think this is a really powerful way to approach all of these issues that we're talking about today, from Measure 110 to you know, the housing crisis. And it's also going to, it includes housing, so we are using some of our funds here in Lane County for deflection to improve access to housing and provide housing to people. And they're also, they're using a model, and I don't recall the name of the model, but it is a model that has been proven to work in other parts of the country. So I'm really excited and hopeful for our model of deflection here in Lane County. And the other piece about it that I want to say is that it is going to include crimes that are related to, as long as there, you know, there's a certain group of charges that will be included. So not just the drug possession, but other things that may be related to that. People will still have an opportunity to deflect, to work with the peers on addressing their issues. So, do you want to add anything to that?
I'm not sure how direct this is to the question. You know, I think a lot of us here have dealt with substance abuse issues with either ourselves or people in our lives, homelessness. I'm currently in a situation where in my family there's homelessness and addiction, and what we do as a society should at some level reflect what we do as individuals. And I know for me, I have to sometimes stop with this, with my family and remember that I'm frustrated and I'm angry and I don't like this, but also that is a person, and it's a person that I love, and remember to encourage that person, and remember to be have confidence in their ability to overcome the circumstance. That's not who you are. The circumstance isn't who you are. How we do that as a society, I don't know, and I don't think that's why anybody asked me to come here. But remembering that as individuals, I think is, at the end of the day, the answer to being able to implement policy at local, state, and the national level.
Good afternoon. I'm not here to ask a question of the panelists, but something that's related to all this. Whitebird's Front Rooms Agency, which does a lot of the same work that HIV does, they're having a funding crisis right now. It's possible they may be closed down within 3 weeks. So I thought I would get up here and let people know of that. It's not out in the world yet, as far as I know. And if anyone's interested, I have an email address where you can send a letter of support to the board of directors of Whitebird in support of the Front Rooms program. What the Front Rooms does is they have interaction every day with the homeless and low-income population, 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And they pass out not only food, but clothing, over-the-counter medicines. They're a clearinghouse for other support within Whitebird and other agencies. And maybe most important, I don't know, they act as a mail drop. So you talk about people losing the connection with somebody. If they don't have a place to get their mail, Social Security, anything else that's important, that's a huge issue with this population.
Yeah, thank you for raising it, and happy to talk more about it after.
Fine.
Thank you.
That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sue Walling, City Club member. And something I struggle with that I'd kind of like your response to is many of us are involved in various efforts to provide services to homeless people, whether it's providing meals or socks or tents or whatever. And it's never wrong to help somebody who's in need. But I also wonder, is it somewhat enabling? In other words, are we making it a little safer, a little less scary to stay where you are than to face the frightening prospect of change? What's the answer?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's such a good question. I think I mentioned earlier we operate a syringe exchange. So I'm going to tie these two things together a little bit here if I can. People will often ask the same thing: are you enabling people by giving them clean supplies so they don't get HIV? And my answer is always the same to that, and that is no, that I've not seen any evidence that giving people supplies that keep them alive or keep them from getting HIV enables them in a way that would keep them houseless or cause them to use drugs. So in my, we do the same thing. We give out socks, we give out shoes, we give out tents and tarps, and people, there's an endless need for this, sometimes it feels. But I also think that people need a place of, there needs to be a base of just, I'm okay, and some level, it's life-saving. People can die from exposure to the cold, and people have died here. I mean, that's why we have warming centers. So I think, at some level, you're keeping people alive so that they can take those next steps, and that's how I see those supplies as well. And giving people an opportunity to do that. I mean, I can't even imagine, sometimes I think about, even say you got the tent, you got the socks, you got the food from the folks who are out there doing it, and that's your reality. And you have to get up in the morning and navigate the Social Security system, or you have to get up in the morning and navigate the VA to get your health care, or navigate any of these other numbers of systems. And people can't do that without, I mean, even on a good night's sleep, it's hard for me to do that. So I think these kinds of things, they feel like you're, sort of throwing supplies into this big, deep hole. But I do think that they're critical for people, as long as we offer something else. And that's what feels, to me important, is that we do that at HIV Alliance. And we offer, do you want to talk to a peer today? Do you want to get signed up to get on the wait list to do these things? Yeah.
So I think it's important to remember that essentially this is a humanitarian crisis that overwhelmingly involves people who were previously housed in our community becoming unhoused and having nowhere to go. And also just how miserable it is. I mean, just like thinking, just like taking a step back and thinking for yourself, would I want to be sleeping outside in the winter when it's like 39 degrees and pouring rain? Like the idea that it would be at all desirable, I wouldn't make categorical statements about everybody anywhere, but it's really awful. And I went on outreach a couple weeks ago with a community partner, and it was raining and it was cold, and I was like, I can't wait to go home. And we met this woman who had been discharged from the hospital, like that was having kidney failure and had this bag full of medications. And it's just, that someone in that situation, that providing them extra supplies would enable them, I find it highly doubtful. It might make their circumstances slightly more comfortable for a time until their campsite is removed and they lose their belongings again. But I think, it's important to just remember people's humanity and maintain empathy, and to consider what the social science shows, that it's not like whether people get socks or not. I don't think that's what determines whether people exit homelessness. The empirical research, the social science research shows that providing housing, social supports, that these are the things that actually have a statistically significant impact. And so I really think pushing for those solutions, even though they take time, is ultimately what's going to alleviate our collective frustration with this horrible humanitarian crisis.
Thank you all so much. That's all the time we have for today. Please join me in thanking our speakers. This has been the City Club of Eugene's November 15th, 2024 conversation about homelessness in the wake of the Supreme Court's ruling. City Club is back next Friday, November 22nd, for another urgent and timely conversation, this one about food insecurity in our region. We'll welcome leaders from Food for Lane County, the Interfaith Food Hub, and Springfield Public Schools. Until then, thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful weekend.